Hi, good afternoon. We are Team 15 and we will present the collaborative activity, which is the identity and false identities. Starting to explain the concept of identity, identity is not something fixed or given, but rather a permanent process of construction. It is formed actively over time through experiences, interaction, and changing conditions. So there are two main types of dimension of the identity. The first one is the personal one, which includes all characteristic traits, values, and experiences that make a person unique. And there is the social one, which refers to who we are based on the groups we belong to and how we understand ourselves in relation to others. So identity happens between people, not in isolation. We see ourselves through the eyes of others, and how others respond to us can shape our understanding of who we are. Creating and sustaining our identity also requires critical thinking, creativity, and metacognition. These mental tools allow us not only to process experiences and reaction, but to interpret them, reflect on them, and intentionally build a sense of self based on meaning, not just the circumstances. Moving on with the importance of recognition and factors around identity construction, why recognition is so important. It is essential in the construction of identity, as it fulfills the deep human need for belonging, dignity, and self worth. When it is denied through the absence of love, rights, or social esteem, it leads to misrecognition, which causes emotional and moral harm like shame, humiliation, and fear. Additionally, false or one sided recognition can distort persons' identity by reducing them to limited traits, ultimately contributing to the same process of misrecognition and the formation of incomplete or false identities. There are three main psychological mechanisms that shape social identity, which include social categorization, social identification, and comparison. In addition to this, there are some actors and structures that influence identity through family and caregivers, peers and social networks, educational institution, state institution, and cultural and media forces.
Indigenous women in Mexico, victims of false recognition. Who are they? Women from the indigenous communities like Mazahua, Otomí, Maya, Zapotec, and Mixe face discrimination based on gender and ethnicity. How are they falsely recognized? Indigenous women are often seen as submissive and disconnected from modern society. They are misrepresented as incapable of making decisions about their own lives, bodies, and communities, reinforcing harmful stereotypes that limit their visibility and agency. But what does society ignore? They ignore their role as community leaders, midwives, and land protectors. Lastly, but most important, teachers and cultural knowledge keepers.
Indigenous women in Mexico face intersecting layers of discrimination based on their gender, ethnicity, and often socioeconomic status. Over time, different elements have created a false identity to this group. For example, the colonial legacy and structural racism. Mexico is a very misogynist country, and if we add that since colonization, indigenous groups were labeled as backwards or uncivilized, this group was very vulnerable. Also, media stereotypes such as TV and films have long portrayed indigenous women as stereotypes roles. For example, maids or folkloric figures or passive background characters. And finally, an unequal access to justice and public services. Institutions often fail to provide an equate support in indigenous languages or recognizing indigenous women forms. According to the 2022 National Survey of Discrimination, 40.8% of them felt that their human rights are not often respected in aspects as social support, medical attention, services in government offices, a prohibition to enter to a bank, business, or shopping centers, or even continue their studies. All these create some characteristic to society of this group, like submissive or lacking of autonomy, being disconnected from the modern world, or being uneducated or ignorant.
The consequences of the imposition of this false identity are mainly two. First, according to the Instituto Nacional de Estadística in 2021, only 2.7% of public office positions in Mexico are held by indigenous women. The assumption that they are not qualified perpetuates their exclusion from decision-making and political participation. Second, indigenous women frequently face obstetric violence, forced sterilization, or are denied access to contraception based on discriminatory assumptions about their autonomy, and this is according to GIRE in 2019. These are just some of the many examples from consequences of labeling or imposing a false identity to a certain community. In this example, we're talking about indigenous women, but this happens in many other groups, vulnerable groups. These consequences not only violate the individual rights of indigenous women, but also limit the collective development of their communities. By reinforcing marginalization through institutional neglect and cultural erasure, false identities become barriers to justice, equity, and inclusion.
For the conclusion, we have these two proposals. The first one is indigenous women in the media, specifying the radio and the film. And the core idea is to give the indigenous woman a real voice in the society. This will be uh, by their own experience, language, and perspective. And this will be achieved to give them some spaces in the radio and also in TV programs. The other one is art from indigenous communities, and the focus is to create opportunities to these indigenous women to present their art in museums and cultural spaces. The idea of these two proposals is to give these women a real voice, and this can be achieved through the art or it can be through the speaking of his own experiences. So basically, this is what we think, and thank you.